Hey everyone, my name is Anna and I will be talking about tetanus. So the formal name for tetanus is Clostridium tetani. The species name comes from the Greek tetanus, which means tension or to stretch. Some common names for tetanus are lockjaw and trismus, which they basically mean the same thing, are spasms in the mastication muscles. Going to the taxonomy, which I'm not going to go over because of the names, but feel free to take a look at them. I actually want to mention a relevant member, which is a Clostridium botulinum, because it shares similarities with tetanus, especially in the production of neurotoxins. So the main characteristics of tetanus are that it's a gram-positive bacteria, its shape is rod bacillus, and it also has a very slender-like structure, as we can see in the first image. It is an obligate anaerobe, as well that it has motility. It is able to produce spores, which is the red sphere structure that we can see in the first image, and they're found in soil, dust, and feces. They're also resistant to environment as well as temperature, which makes them very difficult to eradicate. The actual bacteria produces tetanospasmin, which is the toxin that causes muscle spasm. So the story of tetanus starts in the 5th century BCE, where records contain a clinical description of tetanus. In 1884, tetanus was first produced in animals by injecting them with pus from a fatal human tetanus case. In the same year, the bacteria was reintroduced to animals, but in this time they injected contaminated soil. In 1889, Hitasato Shibasaburo demonstrated that tetanus produced a disease when injected into animals and that the toxin could be neutralized by specific antibodies. In 1897, Edmond Lockhart discovered passive immunization and it was used for treatment in World War I. In the 1920s, the method was discovered to inactivate the toxin with formaldehyde, which led to the development of tetanus toxoid, which is the vaccine that we know today, in 1924, and it was widely used during World War II. So tetanus has a very complex mechanism that starts with C. tetani entering the body through a wound, especially when the spores have contact with the wound, and the wound creates this space, anaerobic space, which allows the spores to germinate. And in this process of germination, tetanospasmin, which is the toxin, starts to be produced. Once the germination is done, the toxin is spread via the lymphatics or the blood. Then the toxin enters the presynaptic terminals in the end plate of motor neurons and destroys the vesicular synaptic membrane, resulting in the inactivation of inhibitory neurotransmitter. Then the toxin travels via the retrograde axonal transport to neurons in the central nervous system where it inhibits neurotransmitter release. So let me see if I can take my pointer out. So in this area over here is where the destruction of vesicular synaptic membrane occurs. Then the toxin travels all the way over here for the inhibition of neurotransmitter release. The main neurotransmitter affected are glycine and GABA. Which fail to prevent the motor reflex response to sensory stimulation, causing tetanic spasm, which is the constant contraction of the muscles. So for the immune response, I couldn't find any information about the adaptive immune response, just about how the toxin is really potent related to its weight, causing a no so effective immune response. But that's when the vaccine comes in and it stimulates the immune system into producing antibodies that specifically attack the toxin. And once they encounter with the bacteria, the immune system effectively triggers a faster and stronger immune response, which causes the neutralization of the toxin and also prevents the disease from developing. So incidence and prevalence in the US in the early 1900s, Actually, the cases of tetanus decreased by the introduction of TIG vaccine, which I'm going to talk about it later on in the presentation. In the 1940s, the vaccine became part of the routine in childhood vaccination, which also affected the decrease in cases. And lastly, since the 2000s, less than 50 cases were reported each year. So now going to the world, it had a similar trend, decreased trend, like in the United States in the 1990s. However, the disease is still predominant in regions like South Asia and Africa, where there are like more agricultural regions and they have like warm weathers, which is where tetanus likes to chill in those kinds of environments. Um, and I couldn't find any recent cases worldwide. Just a 2019 report that mentioned that India had 16,579 cases, followed by Pakistan, Indonesia, and Nigeria. So there has been two outbreaks since the past 2 decades. Both happened in a lapse of a year, and they started with natural disasters, which left the population without basic needs and more vulnerable to prone diseases. So in 2004, Indonesia suffered from a tsunami that reported 106 cases of tetanus with the fatality ratio of 18.9. And in 2005, Kashmir overrode Indonesia in the number of cases, suffering from an earthquake that reported 139 cases of tetanus. So for the diagnosis, there are no lab tests that can tell you if you have tetanus or not. Um, Most of the diagnoses are based on clinical features, physical examination, and medical history. One example of a physical examination is the spatula test, which stimulates the pharyngeal wall that provokes reflex spasms of the mouth muscles, causing the person to bite down instead of gag. So for the clinical features, they are based on three types of tetanus. The generalized, which is the most common one, occurring in 80% of the cases. The neonatal tetanus, which is a form of generalized tetanus and is caused by lack of transfer of passive immunity from the mother to the child. The other type is localized, which is rare and mild compared to generalized type, but it's possible for it to transform into general tetanus. It is characterized by spasms located in the close area to the injury. And the last one is cephalic, which is rare and is a combination between generalized and local tetanus, and is characterized by facial spasms and paralysis due to the injury being located next to the head. So the transmission of the disease is by direct contact of the C. tetani spores with the wound. It is not transmitted from person to person. Some common exposures are puncture wounds, which are caused by nails or needles. Also injuries with dead tissue, which are usually burns and frostbites. And lastly, unclean deliveries and unhygienic core practices, which cause maternal tetanus and neonatal tetanus, respectively. So people who are at risk are newborn babies, pregnant women, people who are 70 years or older, and of course people that have not been vaccinated or that they have not been updated with the tetanus booster, which is every 10 years. Other risk factors are having diabetes, the use of intravenous drugs, and weak immune system. So for the symptoms, the incubation period is about 3 to 21 days with an average of 8 days. During these days is when the symptoms are present, and the severity of the symptoms depends on the distance of the wound from the central nervous system. More severe symptoms are connected with short incubation periods, but the most common symptoms are tightening of the jaw muscles, which is lockjaw, muscle spasms, stiffness, seizures, and difficult swallowing or breathing. The symptoms can lead to complications, which some are laryngospasms, there are spasms in the vocal cords, making it hard to breathe or even speak. Um, Fractures of lung bones, which is caused by muscle spasms. Pulmonary embolism, which is caused by the presence of a blood clot in the artery of the lungs. And lastly, aspiration pneumonia, which is infection in the lungs. Obviously, if these complications are not treated properly, there's a high risk of death. So, for prevention, the CDC suggests two ways of preventions, which are wound treatment and vaccines. There are actually two types of vaccines that tetanus has, which are the active immunization and the passive immunization. For this slide, I'm just going to talk about the active immunization vaccines, but in the next slide, I'm going to talk about the passive immunization vaccine. But before that, let's talk about wound treatment. So first, assess the type of wound. If it's a deep or minor wound, then observe any signs of infections, and based on those observations, give a proper treatment for the wound. If there is a deep wound, it is highly suggested to get it treated with a professional, and more if there is any signs of infection. So now going to the vaccines, there are three vaccines, and the first one is DTaP, which is given to young children, and it consists of 5 doses. The first doses is given to them when they are 2 months old, the second one when they're 4 months old, the third one when they're 6 months old, the fourth one when they're 15 through 18 months old, and the fifth one is actually considered as a booster, so it's given to them when they are 4 through 6 years old. DTaP also works as protection against diphtheria. The second one is TDAP, which is given to preteens that are 11 through 12 years old, and it provides protection against whooping cough. The last one, which is the booster, is TD or TDAP, is given to adults every 10 years. So the treatments are supportive management, which is more for severe cases, and it usually consists of intense care at the hospital with sedation and medical ventilation. Wound treatment, which consists of the removal of damaged or dead tissues. HTIG, which is the first line of treatment and has a passive immunization. The vaccine comes from human blood and also has antibodies, which help fight tetanus and causes a fast protection. Lastly, for medication, it is prescribed diazepam, which is usually used for anxiety, but it also causes a relaxation in the muscles, and it also helps prevent respiratory and cardiovascular complications. For future outlook will be the increase in vaccine coverage, not only when natural disasters are present, but also in regions with not accessible healthcare, for improve of birth practices as well as improve intensive care. As I mentioned before, most of the cases are from pregnant women and newborn babies. And so by programming a safer environment for childbirth, hopefully those number of cases can decrease. Another outlook will be the development of medication for treatment. And lastly, the development of tests to support the diagnosis. Actually, tetanus is hard to diagnose because the diagnosis is only based on physical examination and clinical presentation. So it will be practical to have tests to confirm if you have it or not. These were the sources that I used to do my presentation, and that's the end of my presentation. Thanks for watching.